I'm Amy Hare, and I'm a lecturer in costume at Wimbledon College of Art, and I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Bristol. And the research that I'm presenting here has emerged from the first year of my project, investigating what costume practices can tell us about how we perceive of time and identity through a bodily understanding of the world. I'm interested in how philosophy and costume overlap and intersect, and particularly the philosophies of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his ideas about the phenomenology of perception. One of Merleau-Ponty's suggestions about how we understand the world around us is that all phenomena, that's anything that's not our own body, is perceived through the body. And this is particularly useful idea when it comes to unpacking historical costume, particularly when we then throw in ideas about periodicity, authenticity of performance, and ultimately how the costume can evoke temporality and the passing of time is what my research tries to unravel. Costuming for a given period must always go beyond the strict confines of a notional periodicity and serve as an immediate and bodily nexus between the past, the present moment and the future. And nowhere is this more relevant than in Britain over the past century. If you don't believe me, the first thing you see as you step off a flight into Terminal 3 at Heathrow Airport is this. And it's this image, this little snap I just took on my phone really quickly as I was going along the travelator, that made me start thinking about Britishness and historically costumed bodies, and how Britain exports period dramas to the world, from Merchant Ivory to Downton to Poldark to Call the Midwife. Costuming the past has become part of modernity in Britain over the past century, really, and period costuming has come a long way since that post-war period where it really starts to develop. And we can see its development in tandem with the emergence of dress history as a distinct field of academia, and with the development of new technologies for mediating and disseminating historically costumed bodies. So the questions that I'm aiming to address are: what is the role of costuming in a production that claims to have some kind of national and historical significance? And also, how can the historically costumed body evoke the character and spirit of a nation? The story of modern design in Britain is the story of a nation constantly trying to reconcile the comforts of historicism and the past with the embrace of modernism, newness and progressiveness. Historicism is an integral part of modernity all over the world, but the costumed body as a site of this duality is really rarely considered. When considering this type of costume design, it's often dismissed as a kind of small c conservative pageantry or a commodification of Merry England. It's my suggestion that historical costuming practices that began in post-war Britain are now present in historical costuming for film, theatre and digital media all over the world, and have become an essential signifier of modern British identity. My study focuses mainly on costume designs for productions of Shakespeare plays at the Stratford Memorial Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon and the Old Vic Theatre Company in London between 1946 and 1960, and it tries to place costume design and production at the heart of refashioning a nation that has been destroyed by the ravages of conflict. The costumes designed during this period represent also great leaps forward in scholarship and intellectual endeavours that fed into the performance through the costume design, and in some cases defined the whole production. The Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford itself was an edifice of modernist sensibility built in 1932 rather than a replica of the Elizabethan theatre, and the set design there in the 30s, 40s and 50s reflected a variety of styles rarely concerned with recreating the Renaissance or medieval interior. It was the costumes that were used to summon up the period, that immediate connection from the body to the outside world. The costumes created a perception and understanding of being in the world at that moment, but also in the past for the characters and for the audience. In the 40s, theatre making was used as a kind of a tool of nation building through exhibitions. So there was the British Theatre Exhibition in 1949 in Birmingham, where the material culture of theatre was used to kind of encourage the public to attend historical productions locally and nationally, the idea of going to the theatre as part of your civic pride and your national pride really can be seen here in this particular exhibition. And the twin ideas of kind of modern living and identity are often explored through exhibitions. Interestingly, at this one, the most popular part of the whole exhibition was the historical costumes displayed that had been worn by Shakespearean actors of the late 19th century, like Ellen Terry and Henry Irving. They were very, very popular, and there was a fascination with the actor in costume also seen at a parallel exhibition called Painters and the Theatre, which was held at Birmingham Art Gallery and featured costume designs and paintings of costumed performers. On a broader scale, there was also the national post-war exhibition, the Festival of Britain in 1951, that begun planning in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. The Festival of Britain was designed to be both a beacon for change in Britain and also a kind of autobiography of the nation, establishing British post-war identity. And the festival featured lots of theatrical productions. Almost all of them were Shakespeare. Interestingly, no contemporary playwrights, but Shakespeare was chosen as a vehicle for this kind of nationhood. Productions in London and elsewhere, and an entire history cycle was suggested and was performed at Stratford-upon-Avon. And this is where Shakespeare is trying to define a new national consciousness and a unified past as well. The creation of history through drama at the festival is really significant. The festival organisers were at pains to avoid a kind of chronicle of Britain, no panoramas of Victorian England. They instead wanted to explore history as a series of traditions that Becky Koenikin describes as trans-class, trans-historical, with a sense of a deep past that defines Britishness. And this can be found in the costumes that were designed for these festival productions, and we're going to have a look at those in a minute. Beyond Stratford, Britishness and this idea of national identity that is new but drawing on the past was also being presented at the London exhibition in the Lion and Unicorn Pavilion. It was a slightly curious and sort of singular vision of Britishness, but it is useful to us in our examination of costume. The Lion and Unicorn Pavilion attempted to show and explain the British character with the two creatures symbolising the different aspects of the national character. So on one hand, we've got the realism and strength of the lion, and on the other, we've got fantasy, independence and imagination of the unicorn. But the idea of the lion and the unicorn offering some explanation of British duality when it comes to modernity is not just a kind of quirk of the time. It can also throw some light onto our costume analysis. Using these kind of two faces of the nation, we can examine the bodily perceptions of the past, future and the national identity present in costuming period productions at this time. And there were lots of them, lots and lots and lots of period productions, not just for the Festival of Britain, but around the Festival of Britain, for the coronation in 1953. And the designers sort of fall loosely into two camps. There are those that take the lion route of realism and costume as clothing of the past, sort of period authenticity. And then there's the contrasting, dreamy, artistic sensibility of the unicorn, presenting fantasy and extreme sort of theatricality. And there's also some evidence to suggest that costumes designed by women and men were split along these lines also during this period. Design for the British stage in the post-war period is the only part of theatre making other than acting where you really find women and men kind of equally. However, the hierarchy of craft and gender is very much in place when it comes to making the costumes. Makers are very rarely credited in programmes and so on. And if the design of a performance is commented upon in a review, it's the set, the more traditionally male preserve, that is commented upon rather than the costumes. Costumes very rarely critiqued in contemporary reviews. But from examining the archival material that survives about these productions and around these productions and around the design process for period costume at this time, it's from examining this kind of these documents, it's my suggestion that designers who were trained at the Central School of Art in London in the 1930s, 40s and 50s, who were mostly women, have a costume-centric methodology, and it's a focus, it's not just costume centric, but it's a focus on period cutting techniques and meticulous historical research using primary sources. Very, very important. The Central School had an extensive collection of original historical garments which students could study, they could handle, they would wear them as part of their training, they would move around in them, they would feel them on their bodies, they would also wear usually replicas, although some original pieces of underwear, corsetry and panniers and crinolines and so on. So they would understand how the costume gave rise to the movement and the gesture and the posture of the performer. And this is really important, this emphasis on costume making and wearing as the core training is reflected in their subsequent designs. A part of the Central School methodology can be seen here in these photographs, but you can also see it in the costume manuals that were published slightly later by Nora Waugh, who was a lecturer at the Central School, and the methodology present in these books is basically the way they were teaching students at the Central School all the way through the 30s, 40s, and up until around 1966 when Waugh actually died. So this specific approach to costume is one that gives primacy to period costuming as a lived experience, and that transforms what could be just a period signifier on the stage and a veneer of performance into a way of being, an ontology for the performers. And this idea of authentic costuming as the core of just theatre design more generally is less present in designers who have come to the stage from previous careers or training in fine art or window dressing or interior design, as others did. So here we begin to find the duality of Britishness in costume design, assisted by the allegory of the lion and the unicorn. The lion is costuming that's anchored in the reality of a period setting, built in some way to give a lived experience, a sense of lived experience to the text, whereas the unicorn is one of romanticism, experimentation, mischief and fantasy. We can see an element of the unicorn approach perhaps in these designs by Australian designer Kenneth Roll, who created an ahistorical romantic setting for Richard Burton's Hamlet in 1953. Roll had worked as a window dresser and had a background in ballet design before moving to the classical stage. And in Tanya Mishevich's designs for the Stratford history cycle, we see much more of the lion. That is the Central School approach. Mishević had trained at the Central School in the 1930s, and her set and costume designs for this series of plays is usually praised for its innovative use of the natural wooden thrust staging, which was kind of reminiscent of Shakespeare's Globe. But I think the genius of this production is actually in the costume designs, which show a kind of innate understanding that these characters are kind of living in the costumes. It's a stealthy combination of period cut and innovative use of materials to create the sort of effect of jewels and finery and embellishment and so on. And they're really an understanding that the perception by the audience is what's going to make them a success as real clothing. This doublet, for example, worn by Richard Burton as Henry V, looks extremely exaggerated in the illustration, but in real life, in actuality, it was extremely conducive to movement that gave a sense of period but didn't hinder the performer. Similarly, in the designs for the soldiers, we can see their posture, their sort of ease of movement that is facilitated by the costuming. Really important. Mishević, interestingly, always worked collaboratively as well with assistants, and most importantly with the director Tyrone Guthrie, who would also draw the characters as they were kind of thrashing out what the performance was going to look like. Mishević understood the symbolism and visual impact of fabrics, that tactile phenomenology of fabric that connects with an audience so well. Her thrust stage was very plain and bare, but it was frequently draped with banners and standards. Another element of costume design that Mishević really developed during the history cycle was the breaking down of costumes as part of the costume maker's art, making the clothing look grubby and lived in when necessary to serve the realism of the plot. here in this famous example held at the Victoria and Albert Museum collection, but also here in production photographs, we can see costumes that are shrunken and grubby and hitched up with a belt, as you might do in much more sort of real life situation. This approach to designing costumes that are clothing rather than costume represents a state of being for the actor, perfect for this lion element of the festival and costume design at this time more widely. And they made the theatre go beyond pageantry and cemented a living, breathing Shakespeare into the psyche of a nation. This style and approach and methodology of design was exported to North America in 1952 when Mishevich and Guthrie were invited to Stratford, Ontario to found the Shakespeare Festival theatre there, and the costume workshops that were part of this festival became a training ground for young costume designers, costume assistants, and young graduates from the Central School at that time also came over to work there, and then quickly moved on to Broadway and to Los Angeles, kind of taking this central method with them as they went. In contrast to Mishevich, we have another unicorn designer who was very, very popular at the time. Oh, that's Mishevich again. Yeah, there she is in front of some of her designs. James Bailey gives a completely different approach to periodicity. The agency of the costume here is in creating a conceptualized atmosphere and also a rich, luxurious evocation of period through fabrics and excess. In a post-war Britain that was just emerging from rationing, this would have seemed extremely exciting and theatrical and wonderful, and these designs were particularly praised in the press, whereas the Stratford Festival cycle much less so. But these costumes, they play kind of fast and loose with periodicity. They almost use couture fabrics and futuristic fabrics, the metallic meshes and so on, combined with signifiers of a sort of generalised pastness. And we can see this kind of agency of costume creating a conceptualised atmosphere and idealised characterisation in another Bailey production, Hamlet, a slightly earlier one in 1948. But this kind of lack of historical accuracy, if you like, was exactly the point. For Bailey, the essence of the play can be evoked with a mere suggestion of the period. Costume in this production of Hamlet also raises questions, I think, about male and female gaze in costume design at this time, kind of mirroring what was going on in contemporary fashion, with this Victorian Ophelia having more in common with Christian Dior's new look than perhaps clothing of the 19th century. A designer I'm particularly interested in, who is less well known and less kind of researched, hopefully going to form part of my project, is Alex Stone, another graduate of the Central School. She assisted Tanya Mishevich. They in fact trained together at the Central School. And yeah, Stone spent the first decades of her career as kind of a serial assistant to various different designers. But assistant indicates sort of a kind of bag carrying element, whereas really I think she's more of a co-designer. She's named in programs, for example, as the assistant, which is almost unique for an assistant designer, and her input, if you like, was very much along the lines of the training that she'd had at the Central School. And here you can see her version of designing, where she would look at all of the costumes together as an ensemble, creating an overall vision, but also a deep understanding of movement, and again this kind of lived-in element of the costumes, drawing them from different angles in different postures, combined with a knowledge of the technicality of costume making. The materials for each costume are explored and specified very much in Alex Stone's work. When you look through her designs in her sketchbooks, she either lists the materials or she uses swatches, and she has these highly detailed plans for cutting and construction. Her knowledge of how the garments should be made is really evident, and then combined with how they would be worn. And this element of wearing you can also see in the more individual principal costume designs that she did, demonstrating how the costume could be worn in different ways. it's interesting to consider the agency of these costumes and the subtle but definite way in which the designer has an intention for the cut and construction to then influence and create posture and movement. The characterization of the performance comes from extrinsic force, creating the being on stage in a sort of phenomenological sense through period-informed research and design. So when it comes to the multiplicity of Shakespearean productions in Britain in the decades following the Second World War, when the nation was embarking on a huge programme of transformative national projects such as the National Health Service, social security and social housing, there was also a kind of national soul searching to be found in the theatre. During this period, as we've seen, there was an increasing interest in dress history, much of which was emanating from research carried out by theatrical costume makers and designers. But the British character is not singular, and neither is British costuming, and the lion needs its unicorn, and the painterly designers, whose methodology sprang from a fine art tradition, continued to make theatre as moving pictures within the proscenium arch, aware of performance as a kind of suspension of disbelief and the realm of fantasy where periodicity is just another kind of colour in the paint box. The progressives and the traditionalists, the realists and the dreamers, the work continues to frame how we perceive the past through the costumed body today, and has become the very definition of British design and modernity. Thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to talk and discuss all these issues and more with you later on this month. Thanks very much.